Welcome back to P3. When the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was being built in the 1920s, workers discovered some ancient tombs on the construction site. Now situated within a beautiful botanical garden, these graves are a testament to the astounding history that surrounds you in Israel. Haim Aronovich, the university's director of Israel seminars, is an expert on this area.
Standing in the Hebrew University, what is the significance in the founding of this incredible place?
Okay, you happen to be asking me that question on the first day of the academic year, which is just opening now, the year of 2009-10. And on that day, I've chosen as a backdrop the picture which captures the dedication of the university back on April the 1st, 1925.
Wow.
If you look at the picture, and I'm going to suggest that we take one or two elements out, one of the most interesting features is firstly the mass of people that are here. When I was trying to explain to students the other day what this number means, I reminded them and reminded myself of being in Central Park seeing Simon and Garfunkel, and proportionally, this is a larger assembly in Palestine of 1925 than Simon and Garfunkel could get into Central Park in New York when I heard them in about 1980 or so.
It is incredible.
What you've got here is a very, very large number of people assembling, between 10 and 12,000 people, because the event was not an event merely of the opening of a university. It was really seen in terms of the Jewish people as an event of great magnitude. And therefore, one of the features of this, I'll come back to the question of the view a little bit later with you, but one of the features which is very, very prominent here is those figures who are sitting as the guests of honor at the ceremony, along with the 10 to 12,000 people who are sitting in a kind of a natural amphitheater looking at the view here. At the very center, you can see a fellow in his red robes. He's the chancellor of a little-known university in England called Cambridge.
Oh, wow.
He's the guest of honor. He's making his address later on. Perhaps we'll relate to some of the words that he uses there. But along with him, in the first row of people, are some of the most distinguished people involved in the establishment of the university and people who are central figures within the Jewish world at the time. So what you've got here is a moment in time in which you could almost say that for the Jewish people, this wasn't just a matter of saying the University of Chicago or New York University, i.e. the University of Jerusalem. This was the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was actually seen as a project of national significance for all of the Jewish people around the world.
That to me really hits me when you say that, because what you have here is the founding of a university around a people before the birth of a country.
You're touching on a very interesting point, Randall, because in fact, in 1897, the World Zionist Organization is established. Within the first 3 or 4 years, they're already saying, and we have to establish a university. They don't know what it's going to be called. They're thinking of calling it the Jewish University.
Right.
But what becomes the Hebrew University is really part and parcel of the development of the Jewish national movement from the beginning of the century.
It's not often that I'm in a botanical garden and I see tombs that are 2,000 years old. What is the significance of these tombs?
All right. There's an interesting story here. It takes us back to before the university itself is established. The estate on which the university began its physical career, really, was purchased from Lord or Sir Greyhill and his wife, Lady Greyhill, and they had already been living here from 1890. In the early 1900s, their workers uncovered what turned out to be a whole system, one of the most complex burial chamber systems in the whole of the Jerusalem area.
Wow.
And in fact, you'll notice that there are openings all over here, behind us, around us, at least 5 different openings into systems of burial chambers, which go back to the time when the Second Temple was still standing. To give you the sense of things, we're talking about the time prior to and around the time of the life of Jesus. So in that context, something remarkable happened in the early 1900s. In 1902, as they were uncovering one of the caves, the one that is now behind me, they found what every archaeologist dreams of. A bone box, an ossuary, as opposed to a sarcophagus, which is much larger, an ossuary which is big enough to hold the thigh bone, the skull, and therefore all the other bones of the body. But what was special about it was not just the ossuary, it was that they also found on it an inscription. This is the days before you've got Microsoft and before you've got Google.
Right.
But what they really had to do, what the archaeologists had to do, was to take the information on that box and try and interpret it. And I think that basically the way that I understand it is that they did a Google search on a hard disk. And what they found was that the inscription referred to a man by the name of Nicanor of the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And it said on the sarcophagus, "He of the gates." When they did that Google search, they came up with a quote from the Babylonian Talmud, or the Mishnah actually, which tells us that Nicanor was a fellow from Alexandria who gave bronze gates to the temple, which is the very temple which was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans.
Wow.
So we're going back to a burial chamber that you can understand what it means to an archaeologist to be able to say, this is almost definitely, I've got the conclusive evidence in front of me that this is where Nicanor and his family were buried.
Wow, and this is the same man who gave these gifts,
Exactly.
these gates to the city, which we know when the gates were, so you can make that cross date.
You've got the cross references there.
Yeah.
And the importance of those references would really take us to what I think is the symbolism of the later development of this area. Because if the tombs were identified as Nicanor and his family tombs from close to 2,000 years earlier, what happens in the 1930s and the early 40s is that a move is made to say, let's bury figures who are central to what you could call the pantheon of the Zionist movement in the graves which were uncovered from 2,000 years before. I'm going to take a leap with you, and I'm going to suggest to you that in fact what they were doing, one of the men who's buried over here, a man by the name of Osishkin, he's now a street in many cities in Israel, but Osishkin turns around and he says, we're going to bury first my great teacher and ideologue, a fellow by the name of Pinsker, and then when he dies, he's buried alongside him in the same tomb where they found Nicanor's Asheri. And what they really wanted to do, I think, was to say that if this figure from the Jewish diaspora of 2,000 years prior to
When
today,
the Jews spread all around the world.
when they were all over the ancient Near East, you could say, if he was to be buried in Jerusalem, and he's a figure who helped build the Temple of Jerusalem, we're in fact going to try and see that we bury the great figures bringing about what you could call the third Jewish Commonwealth. If that was the second temple that was built in Herod's time and destroyed by the Romans, it's as if they're talking about building a third temple.
Interesting.
It's a very different temple though, because this is on the grounds of a university. And in fact, in the 30s and 40s, the idea was that each of these burial chambers were going to be used to create a pantheon. But in 1948, early in that year, Hebrew University gets cut off from the rest of Jerusalem. And by the time that the state is declared and the first truce during the War of Independence takes place, the university can't function anymore. What happens thereafter is that the figures who would have been buried here get buried in alternative places, like on a place called Mount Herzl on the outskirts of the city, where Theodor Herzl, the Zionist central figure of modern Zionism, is buried. But I wager that had the War of Independence gone differently and this would have remained integral to the city of Jerusalem under Israeli control, you would have in fact been coming to a big parking lot nearby because Herzl would have been buried where we are right now. In fact, you're going to have to make another trip to see that.
It was truly amazing to stand and experience what people had experienced thousands of years before me. What a trip. More P3 coming up next.